I want to stay on issues related to climate now. You've seen those devastating bushfires, wildfires as they call them, blazing across America's west coast in California and Oregon. They've killed at least 35 people. As I showed you yesterday, this has also sparked a fresh debate on climate change, the same crazy debate we saw in this country over the last summer. It's now playing out in the US election campaign. I spoke earlier today to the energy policy and environmental expert and the author of Apocalypse Never, Michael Shellenberger. Michael Shellenberger, thanks for joining us again. First up, I wonder if you can just tell us what the situation is with the fires today, whether they've eased off, whether firefighters have been able to get on top of any of the more damaging blazes?
The firefighters are doing a great job. It's a huge job, though. There's 3 million acres have burned, which is a modern record. We know that in the past, somewhere between 4 and 12 million acres burned annually before Europeans arrived, but certainly a record for today. Almost 30 people dead, many homes destroyed. It's been quite catastrophic. And so, yeah, I mean, it does appear that progress is being made, but the size of the fires there's so many fires and they're so large, it's been difficult to contain. The vision we've seen here has been shocking. Whole communities flattened, of course, as you say, lives lost. These are images that are very familiar to Australians. In fact, the whole scenario here is very similar to what happened in Australia's most recent summer, and that is that these are extreme fires, very, very bad fires by the standards of European settlement. But how do you place them? When people start throwing in terms like unprecedented and the worst ever, do those claims stack up? Well, I think it's important to distinguish between two different kinds of fires. So we know that before Europeans arrived in California, there was between 4 and 12 million acres burned annually. There's some questions around the certainty on those numbers, but nonetheless, we know a huge amount of acreage burned, much more than did today. But those were low-intensity fires. They tended to burn the ground of the forests, which is very healthy for forests. They need that burning to be going on. And so what we're dealing with today are these high-intensity fires that reach into the tops of the trees, or what we call the crowns of the trees. And these fires are so intense because there is about 5 times more fuel wood, there's 5 times more debris in the forests than there was before we started fire suppression over a century ago. And so the fires are so intense that they sometimes can turn our forests into more like shrubland. And that's one of the big concerns, is that it ends up just changing the whole ecosystems. But as I'm sure we'll talk about, this is a problem that we have not dealt with and that we are still not dealing with because we're continuing to try to ascribe it all to climate change. Yeah, we've had very similar debates in Australia. It's the same situation. The pre-European settlement history where the fires were common and burned for extended periods. And of course, when we suppress fires now, we allow huge fuel loads to build up in bushland and national park areas. Then they do burn after perhaps 15, 25 years without a bushfire, and you suddenly get that huge explosion of fuel at the end of a drought. And they're much more damaging. So apart from anything else, apart from the natural management, we've really got to make sure that we protect settled areas so that lives and property are protected. Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, look, we have badly managed our forests, and there's really the main reason for it is ideology, is just a kind of dogmatism. We haven't been properly taking care of them. But there is something interesting that's also happened here, which is that we see that there are well-managed forests. There are pockets of well-managed forests, or islands of well-managed forests. And what we've seen now is these high-intensity fires will burn all around these well-managed forests. But then when they reach the well-managed forest, the fire drops out of the crowns, out of the trees, onto the ground, and it becomes a low-intensity fire, still hotter than a prescribed burn, but still nonetheless not a high-intensity fire. And what that proves is that we are not doomed to high-intensity fires, and that the determining factor is forest management, not climate change.
Now, you've got this climate change debate going on. As you say, it's almost a replication of what we've heard after Australia's summer. You've got the state Democrat governor there saying this is a climate emergency. You've got Joe Biden blaming this on Trump, effectively, saying you'll get more bushfires under Donald Trump.
If you give a climate arsonist 4 more years in the White House, why would anyone be surprised if we have more America ablaze?
Now, you believe the science. You're an environmentalist. What role does climate change play in this?
Well, when I was doing the research for Apocalypse Never, I interviewed all of the top forest scientists in the state, and they were very clear about this. Look, we agree climate change is happening. It is contributing to higher temperatures and a longer fire season. But the determining factor is the accumulation of wood fuel. And so we're obviously seeing that. We're seeing that well-managed forests are surviving climate change, and they're even surviving these mega fires, these high-intensity fires. And I think that's really good news. It means that we're not doomed. This is not the end of the world. We can manage a world with modestly higher temperatures. It's disappointing to see how politicized it got. Of course, I understand we're 2 months away from an election, so I'm not naive about it, but it is disappointing because actually you are seeing more agreement that we do need to manage our forests well, and that's at risk, I think, of that bipartisan agreement is at risk of being destroyed by this hyper-politicization around climate apocalypse.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because we should be talking about whether climate change increases what's already been or always going to be a very severe threat from bushfire. But forest management in Australia and California, in Mediterranean Europe, that's what we can do in the here and now to manage the risk. And no matter what happens with climate change, that management's going to be important. I want to get your thoughts then finally on what I think is almost the insane political rhetoric we're hearing. We ran Joe Biden yesterday saying that if there's 4 more years of Trump, there'll be more bushfires and more floods in the US, as if somehow the 4-year term of an American president can affect severe weather patterns on the US continent.
Well, that's just silly. No scientist, no reputable scientist would agree with such a statement. Obviously, there's many decades past before carbon dioxide turns into greater warming. But again, it's global. You would probably have had these high intense fires without any global warming. And we know that even with this global warming that we've had, that well-managed forests can survive. And so I think it's quite misleading, and I'm very disturbed by the impact that it's having on young people in particular. My daughter's 14. She's fine because I explained the science to her, but her friends aren't sure they're going to live long enough to have kids. And there's even a sense among most people in California that we're sort of doomed to this, that climate change dooms us to this, because everybody knows that, look, we're going to have continued warming just as a consequence of human development. But that's not the end of the story. And I think when the emphasis is put so much on climate change, it's quite disempowering. And I think it only contributes to rising anxiety and depression, which is simply unethical, especially at a time when we see so much anxiety about so many other things.
Thanks again for joining us, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
It all sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it? How about people just stick to the facts and have sensible discussions?